Ancient Rome was not only a magnificent empire spanning 3 continents, but also a world that is still shrouded in mystery. We are familiar with gladiators, brave legions, and majestic temples. But what do we know about the lives of ordinary people? In the shadow of grand events and architectural masterpieces, there was another Rome. Rural, peasant Rome. How did ordinary people, whose hands smelled of earth rather than incense, survive? It is particularly interesting to learn how they endured the harsh seasons. Winter in Italy, especially in the north and in the foothills, could be really cold with frost and snow. How did Roman peasants, without modern technology, cope with the cold? Watch the video and immerse yourself in a world where survival depended on stoves, warm clothes, and the ingenuity of simple Roman peasants. Roman architecture, even at the level of peasant houses, was surprisingly well thought out. The main building material for rural dwellings was usually clay mixed with straw. This material, known as cementus, was not only cheap and readily available, but also had excellent thermal insulation properties. Clay walls retained the heat accumulated during the day and slowly released it at night. The roof was usually made of tiles laid in several layers. This created an air gap that further insulated the house from the cold. Some houses were built with a slight slope towards the south to make the most of the daytime sun for heating. Windows, if there were any, were closed with wooden shutters and sometimes with animal skins. This was necessary to protect the dwelling from wind and drafts. But a house alone was not enough. Winter required constant attention and effort. Inside the house, the hearth was the center of all life. It was not only used for cooking, but was also the main source of heat around which the whole family gathered. Firewood for the hearth was gathered in the fall and carefully dried so that it would burn longer and hotter. Sometimes coal was used, but it was more expensive, so it was usually mixed with firewood. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, which of course did not provide ideal ventilation, but was an acceptable solution for those conditions. The air in the house was always filled with the smell of smoke, earth, and food, which for a peasant was the smell of home. In addition to the hearth, other devices were used for heating. On particularly cold nights, warm stones heated on the fire were placed under the blankets. This was a simple and effective way to warm the bed. Clothing also played a key role. Peasant clothing was made of coarse wool, which retained heat well. Men wore tunics, and women wore long dresses with cloaks over them. At night, people slept in the same clothes they wore during the day and put thick woolen socks on their feet. These simple measures helped them survive the coldest nights. However, winter was not only a time of survival, but also a period when life in the fields came to a standstill. It was a time for repairing tools, weaving baskets, making pottery and other crafts. Women were engaged in weaving, spinning wool, and sewing. Men repaired equipment, made wooden items, and prepared new tools for spring sowing. This was a period when family ties became particularly strong. Evenings were spent together, telling stories and passing on knowledge and traditions from generation to generation. The elderly shared their wisdom, the children listened, and the young people dreamed of future harvests. Winter also provided an opportunity to establish social ties. Peasants often gathered together to share work and rest. The feasts, though modest, were filled with conversation and laughter. It was at such moments that neighborly relations were strengthened, and sometimes friendships were formed that lasted a lifetime. This time was especially important for young men and boys, because being away from women, they could freely express their feelings and share their innermost thoughts. Some of these friendships grew into something more, into close, trusting relationships that Roman society, despite its strict patriarchy, not only did not condemn but to some extent tolerated, as long as they did not interfere with family obligations. During these cold months when nature stood still, human life continued, becoming more intimate and focused on the most important things: family, community, and survival. Peasants did not have the luxuries of the patricians. Their lives were simple and harsh, but they knew that a real home was not just walls, but the people who filled it. Tell us in the comments, were you surprised by the ingenuity of Roman peasant houses? Which of these techniques do you think could be useful today? As already mentioned, the hearth was a key element in a Roman peasant house. It was not just a fire, but a specially equipped place, Most often it was a shallow pit lined with stones. Sometimes a grate was placed on top for cooking. The hearth was fueled by wood, dry grass, straw, and even dried manure. The latter was especially important in areas where forests were scarce. The hearth was not just a source of heat, but also the center of family life. Family members gathered around it to eat, talk, and work. Here, women cooked bean and lentil stew, baked flatbread, and dried herbs. The smell of cooking, mixed with the aroma of burning wood and smoke, created a unique atmosphere of comfort. Children sat nearby, listening to stories told by their elders, or helping with simple tasks such as stoking the fire or cleaning vegetables. On winter evenings, when the wind howled outside and the world was plunged into cold darkness, the hearth was the only source of light and heat, bringing everyone together under one roof. In addition to cooking, the hearth was used to heat water, which was essential for hygiene and to dry clothes. A wet woolen tunic hung by the fire would dry quickly and could be worn again by morning. This simple but effective method allowed people to stay healthy and warm. Every evening, the hearth was carefully extinguished to save fuel, but in the morning it was rekindled using the embers left over from the night before. Keeping the fire going was an important task, as it was not easy to get a new one going. The hearth was also the center of spiritual life. Many Roman peasants believed that every house was inhabited by household deities, the lares and penates, who protected the family. They brought them small gifts, pieces of food, wine, or flowers, leaving them by the hearth, which was considered their home. It was a kind of silent dialogue between humans and higher powers, which gave a sense of security and hope. Faith helped people survive hardships, instilling in them the belief that they were not alone in their struggle against the harsh conditions of life. In winter, when there was no work in the fields, the hearth became a place for long conversations and reflection. Men returning from hunting or the forest shared news. They talked about their neighbors, the weather, and rumors from the nearest town. It was a time when people could relax and talk about their innermost thoughts. Sometimes the topics of conversation touched not only on practical matters, but also on feelings and relationships. In a village where everyone knew each other from childhood, there were no strict boundaries. Men who worked together shared their most personal thoughts with each other. At such moments, sitting by the fire, they could talk about their feelings for other men, about the strong attachment and tender care that was part of their world. These relationships, based on mutual respect and support, were no less important than the bonds of marriage and helped them survive any adversity. Each crackling log in the hearth reminded them of the value of simple things: warmth, food, and communication. This simplicity was the foundation of the Roman peasant's existence. There was no place for luxury in his world, but there was plenty of room for friendship, love, and humanity. It was in these simple truths that the inner spark that warmed them in the coldest of times lay. What do you think is more important in our lives, external well-being, or that inner spark that warms us from within when it gets cold outside? That's exactly what we're going to talk about next. Some Roman houses, especially those in colder regions, used more advanced technologies for heating. One of these was the hypocaust system. It was, in essence, a primitive form of central heating. Channels were laid under the floor of the house, through which hot air from the stove circulated. The heat warmed the floor and was evenly distributed throughout the room. You could even sleep on the stone floor to keep warm. The floors were not everywhere, but only in certain rooms. As a rule, they were in the house that was intended for receiving guests and for spending time together. Usually, this was where not only family members gathered, but also close friends to spend time talking and playing games. However, even if a peasant did not have a hypocaust, he still found ways to use stones for heating. Large flat stones, heated in the hearth, were wrapped in cloth or skins and placed in beds. They retained heat for a long time, helping to survive the cold night. It was a simple but incredibly effective method that was used everywhere. In addition to stones, other heating devices were also used in everyday life. Small portable braziers or focals filled with smoldering coals could be carried from room to room. This made it possible to heat a small room where there was no hearth. These braziers were often placed under tables or near where people sat so that the heat rose and warmed their feet and bodies. They were especially useful when it was necessary to work or read away from the main hearth. Clothing and bedding also played an important role in combating the cold. Peasants sewed blankets from coarse wool, sometimes with the addition of goat or sheep wool. These blankets were heavy and dense, but they retained heat very well. On particularly cold nights, animal skins, most often sheepskins, were used and placed on top of the blankets. Winter was a time when the community came together. Neighbors helped each other with firewood, house repairs, and tool maintenance. People gathered in the warmest houses to share food and conversation. These gatherings, imbued with a spirit of camaraderie, provided not only physical warmth but also emotional support. Young men often gathered together to play dice or drink wine. Away from the watchful eyes of the elders and women, they could be themselves, sharing their thoughts and experiences. These gatherings were often accompanied by jokes and merriment, and sometimes by more serious conversations. In Roman society, where men were raised in a spirit of military valor and restraint, such moments provided an opportunity to show tenderness and care. Young people who spent a lot of time together at work and at leisure could develop a special bond with each other. These bonds, based on mutual respect and understanding, were an important part of life. In difficult times, they served as a source of comfort and strength. Peasants understood that survival in harsh conditions was only possible through cooperation. And these relationships, whether family or friendship, were the invisible force that helped them overcome the cold and adversity. Thus, life in rural Rome, though difficult, was filled with simple joys, and true warmth was found not so much in the stones as in the hearts of the people who shared their work and leisure with one another. Roman peasants, unable to use complex technologies, resorted to simple but effective ways to keep warm. The clothes they wore consisted of several layers. The bottom layer was usually a tunic made of linen or wool. A thicker tunic was worn over it, and sometimes a cloak. All items were made of natural materials that retained heat well. Woolen blankets and animal skins were used for sleeping. Hay or straw was laid on the beds to provide additional insulation from the cold floor. Hot water bottles filled with hot coals or water were also used. They were wrapped in cloth and placed under the blanket. There were other ways to keep warm, such as huddling together. This is exactly what Roman peasants did, without embarrassment, because in ancient Rome, closeness was not limited to family ties. In addition to physical devices, Roman peasants used other, more subtle methods to maintain mental and physical warmth. During the winter months, when agricultural work stopped, life slowed down and people spent more time in their homes. This was a time for strengthening social ties, which were just as important as physical warmth. Neighbors often gathered together to share a meal, talk, and spend time playing simple games. These gatherings, filled with laughter and conversation, fostered a sense of community that made people feel safe and not alone. Men who worked side by side in the fields every day knew each other like no one else. On these winter evenings, sitting by the hearth, they could afford a candor they rarely showed in public. Over a mug of wine or a simple soup, they discussed not only everyday problems, but also shared their experiences, fears, and even hopes. In a rural environment where everyone had known each other since childhood, there were no strict boundaries. These conversations often developed into deep emotional bonds based on mutual respect and support. Some of these relationships were particularly close, filled with tenderness and care, which, unlike in urban Rome, where such bonds were often frowned upon, here in the countryside were seen as part of everyday life. In such a simple and natural atmosphere, closeness between men was not considered shameful, but rather a source of comfort and strength. After all, who better than your best friend can understand you in the most difficult situations? Mutual assistance was the basis of survival, and these bonds, whether kinship or based on friendship and love, were the invisible foundation on which their entire society rested. They not only shared their labor, but also their hearts. These simple but deep human connections helped them survive the harshest winters, when it seemed that the cold and darkness would never end. The peasants understood that true wealth was not gold or land, but those who were close to you. This wisdom was passed down from generation to generation. It was this wisdom that made their lives, though hard, full of meaning and warmth. We talked about warm homes, clothes, and even hugs, but what really warms us from the inside, even when it's freezing outside? That's right, delicious and hearty food. Stay with us. We'll talk about it very soon. Food played an important role in the fight against the cold. Roman peasant cuisine was simple but nutritious. During the cold season, the diet consisted of cereal porridge, legumes, soups, and stews. These dishes were rich in carbohydrates and proteins, which gave the body energy to stay warm. Thick soups cooked over an open fire in large cauldrons were especially popular. They could contain lentils, chickpeas, various vegetables, and, if you were lucky, pieces of meat. Spices such as pepper and ginger were added to these soups for their warming effect. Hot food not only filled you up, but also warmed you from the inside, helping the body cope with the cold. The main dish on the table of a Roman peasant was pulpa, a thick porridge made from spelt or barley. It was cooked with legumes, vegetables, and sometimes with salted meat or lard. Pulpa was incredibly nutritious and took a long time to digest, providing a lasting feeling of fullness and warmth. It was often prepared in large quantities to last for several days. In the morning, it was reheated with new ingredients added, which made its taste slightly different each time. During the winter months, when fresh vegetables were scarce, preserves were used. Vegetables such as cabbage and turnips were pickled, and legumes and grains were dried. Meat was salted or dried. These simple preservation methods allowed peasants to have a supply of food for the entire winter. Bread baked from coarse flour was the staple of the diet. It was dense and heavy, but provided a lot of energy. It was often dipped in soup or eaten with olive oil and garlic. Food was not just a source of calories, but also an occasion for socializing. Family dinners where everyone gathered together were an important part of the day. In winter, when evenings were long, people spent more time enjoying a leisurely meal. During meals, people shared news, discussed plans for the coming year, and simply enjoyed each other's company. This ritual created a sense of stability and security in a world that could be unpredictable. Wine mixed with hot water was also a popular drink during the cold season. Not only did it warm you up, but it also had antiseptic properties. Sometimes honey and spices were added to it, creating a kind of mulled wine that was especially enjoyable on frosty evenings. At these moments, sitting around the common table, people felt part of something bigger. Friendship and solidarity were as important for survival as a warm home or a hearty meal. In a rural community where everyone knew everyone else, there were close ties. Men who spent their days doing hard work often shared their innermost thoughts. Over a meal, away from prying eyes, they could talk about their feelings for other men, about the special bond that had formed in their shared struggle for survival. Their relationships, based on respect and mutual support, were an integral part of their lives. This was not something unusual or shameful, but rather a natural expression of deep friendship and camaraderie. Thus, food, drink, and warm conversations filled with laughter and candor became the very source of warmth that helped Roman peasants survive the harshest winters. They knew that food nourishes the body, but only a kind word and a friendly hand can warm the soul. In cold weather, Roman peasants tried to spend more time together. The whole family gathered in a large room with a fireplace. Here they ate, talked, and simply warmed themselves. The heat from the fireplace, mixed with the warmth of human bodies, created a special atmosphere in the room. Spending time together also included games, songs, and stories. This helped to distract from the cold and harsh everyday life. Such gatherings were not only a way to keep warm, but also to strengthen family and friendship ties. In winter, when work in the fields came to a standstill, rural life became more measured and focused on the home. Days were spent in simple activities. Men repaired tools, women spun and wove, children listened to stories and helped their elders. These routine activities strengthened the sense of community and interdependence. Everyone knew their role, and everyone was important for the survival of the entire family and community. Evenings were especially important. After a meager dinner, when the hearth was dying down, people would sit closer together to keep warm. Conversations flowed slowly, echoes of the day mingling with memories of the past and hopes for the future. Unlike in a big city, the rural community was tightly knit. There were no strangers here, and everyone knew each other's life stories. This created an atmosphere of trust in which it was easier to share thoughts and feelings. On evenings like these, when the wind howled outside, young men could afford to be more open. They often shared their most intimate thoughts and feelings. In Roman society, where men were raised in a spirit of military valor and restraint, such moments were especially precious. These close friendships, which often developed into something more, were part of life. In rural areas, they were not frowned upon, but rather considered a normal part of human relationships. After all, who else but your closest friend could understand your fears and support you in difficult times? Such relationships based on mutual respect and support were no less important for survival than food and warm clothing. They provided emotional warmth that warmed the soul. In these close-knit groups around the hearth, people found not only physical warmth, but also peace of mind. Playing games, singing songs, and telling stories together not only helped pass the time, but also served as a kind of therapy. They distracted people from the harsh realities of life and reminded them of the joy and beauty that still existed in their world, despite all the difficulties. These moments were especially important for children who, listening to stories about heroes and gods, learned to understand the world around them and find their place in it. Roman peasants understood that even in the coldest and darkest times, it was important to find reasons for joy and communication. So, during the day, they warmed themselves by the fire, and in the evenings, they huddled together. But what did they do when night fell and everyone had to sleep? We'll tell you very soon. Winter nights were long and cold, but Roman peasants found ways to make them more comfortable. Before going to bed, they drank hot wine or herbal liqueurs. This not only helped them stay warm, but also helped them fall asleep quickly. Some homes used special clay pots filled with hot water and placed under the blankets to warm the bed. It was also common for several people to sleep in the same bed. This was especially common in large families where every room was needed. Sleeping together was not just a way to save space, but also an effective survival strategy. The warmth of human bodies pressed against each other created natural heating, which was especially valuable in cold and windy houses. Children slept next to their parents, and brothers and sisters slept together. This was completely natural and did not cause embarrassment, as comfort and warmth were paramount. Life in a rural community was simple, and its customs differed from those in Rome. Practicality and survival were valued here, not strict social conventions. Men who spent their days in the fields ate together, worked together, shared the hardships of life, and sometimes slept together in cramped quarters and friendly closeness. This closeness provided not only physical warmth, but also emotional support, which was so necessary in the harsh reality. Such relationships were a natural continuation of their deep friendship, based on mutual trust and respect. Winter nights were a time when the outside world receded, and only the most important things remained: the warmth of family and loved ones. Before going to sleep, people often told each other stories, sang old songs, or simply talked quietly until they fell asleep. These rituals helped relieve the tension that had built up during the day and created a feeling of peace and security. As the saying goes, small spaces are cozy, and this was true for Roman peasants. They understood that true warmth does not come from luxury and wealth, but from the people around you. Mutual aid, friendship, and love were their greatest treasures. This was especially important when family life was not going well. Some young men found comfort and support in relationships with other men. These bonds, based on deep emotional attachment, helped them survive loneliness and cope with difficulties. Thus, nights full of comfort were the result not only of physical adaptations, but also of strong human relationships. Roman peasants proved that even in the harshest conditions, warmth can be found if there are people nearby who are willing to share both the cold and the fire with you. And this wisdom remains relevant today. Preparations for winter began long before the cold weather set in. In summer and autumn, peasants gathered firewood, dried straw, and stored food. Firewood was chopped and stacked in wood piles, protected from the rain. Straw was collected for use as bedding and for insulating homes. Preparing food was one of the most important tasks. Grains, legumes, and vegetables were dried, salted, or pickled so that they would keep until spring. This ensured that the family had food for the entire winter when fresh produce was unavailable. Each member of the family had their own role in this process. Men did heavy physical work. They chopped trees in the forest, gathered firewood, and repaired buildings. They worked in pairs or small groups, which made the work more efficient and safer. Women and children were responsible for harvesting, drying, and preserving crops. They fermented cabbage, pickled olives, and dried fruit in the sun. This collaborative effort strengthened family ties and created a sense of unity. Preparing for winter was not only a physical process, but also a social one. Neighbors often helped each other by exchanging food and tools. This exchange was part of the rural economy and helped everyone survive in case of crop failure or illness. During these months, when work was particularly hard, people found comfort in communication and mutual assistance. In the evenings, after a long day, they gathered around the hearth to share food and conversation. It was a time when young men, tired from work, could relax and talk about their feelings. In a rural environment where everyone knew each other from childhood, there were no strict social barriers, and their conversations could be very personal. Some of these friendships, formed through working together, were particularly deep. Far from the harsh world of politics and war, they could express tenderness and affection that they could not always show openly. These relationships, based on mutual respect and understanding, were an integral part of their lives. They helped them survive hardships and find joy in simple things. After all, who else but a close friend could understand your fatigue and help you cope with difficulties? Special attention was also paid to animals. Livestock was moved to warm stables to protect them from the cold. Hay and grain were harvested for them. Animals were an important part of the peasant economy, and their well-being was essential for the family's survival. Sheep were sheared, and their wool was used to make warm clothes and blankets. Winter was a challenge, but Roman peasants approached it with wisdom and patience accumulated over centuries. They knew that the key to survival was not only physical strength, but also the ability to work together, support each other, and find warmth in human relationships. They cherished every moment spent together because it was these moments that gave their lives meaning. Thus, preparing for winter was not just a matter of gathering firewood and food, but a whole ritual that strengthened the community and reminded them of the value of simple things. They understood that true wealth was not gold or land, but those who were close to you, ready to share both work and joy. This awareness helped them overcome any difficulties. Sometimes when they had a free moment, they would gather in workshops or barns to work on small but important tasks, such as weaving fishing nets or repairing clay pots. This was a time to share jokes and stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. These moments were just as valuable as working in the fields. At such moments, away from the eyes of women, young men could be more candid. They shared their thoughts about life, their hopes, and how they saw their future. Some of these conversations were so personal that only the two of them could understand them. And it was in these conversations, far from the hustle and bustle of society, that the deepest bonds were formed, making their lives more meaningful and warm. Winter was a time of rest from hard farm work. During these months, people had more free time. They gathered together to socialize, tell stories, and play board games. One of the popular games was La Tricina, a primitive version of chess played on a board carved out of wood. Various holidays and festivals dedicated to the gods and the earth were also held at this time. Winter was not only a time of survival, but also a period when people could enjoy the simple pleasures of life. After the autumn harvest, when the barns were full and the firewood was chopped, the peasants could afford to relax. Evenings by the hearth were filled with laughter, songs, and stories. The elders passed on the wisdom of their ancestors to the young, told legends about gods and heroes, and shared practical advice on farming. It was a time when history and traditions came alive in words and memories. In addition to board games, gambling, such as dice games, was a popular pastime. These games were often accompanied by heated arguments and jokes, which added to the fun of the long winter evenings. In rural areas, where life was uneventful, these games were a great way to escape from everyday worries and simply enjoy the company of friends. Holidays such as Saturnalia, which were celebrated in December, were especially important. It was a time of universal merriment and equality, when slaves and masters switched roles and all social barriers were temporarily removed. People gave each other small gifts, feasted and celebrated. It was a time when the community came together and forgot about social differences, reminding everyone that they were one family, one community, bound by a common destiny. In a rural community where everyone knew each other from childhood, these holidays were filled with a special warmth. Men who worked side by side every day could allow themselves to relax and be themselves. Far from the harsh world of politics and war, they could express their feelings, share their secrets, and simply enjoy each other's company. It was during these moments that close friendships were formed, which were an integral part of their lives. These relationships, based on mutual respect and understanding, were the invisible force that helped them overcome adversity. In such an atmosphere, closeness between men was not considered shameful, but rather a natural expression of deep friendship and affection. After all, who else but your closest friend could understand your fears and support you in difficult times? Such relationships help them survive loneliness and cope with the difficulties that inevitably arose in the harsh reality. Winter was not only a time of rest, but also a period when people found solace in art and creativity. They made wooden toys, wove baskets, and created clay pots. These crafts were not only a way to pass the time, but also a way to express themselves. Every object created by human hands carried a piece of the maker's soul. Thus, the winter months in rural Rome were a time when life slowed down and people focused on what was most important: family, friends, and simple pleasures. They understood that true happiness does not lie in wealth, but in the ability to enjoy each day and find warmth in the hearts of loved ones. In addition to community gatherings and games, there were other, more personal ways to entertain themselves. For example, many men were fond of sports competitions. During the short winter days, when the weather permitted, they would organize wrestling or running matches. This was not only a way to stay in shape, but also an opportunity to demonstrate their strength and agility. In these competitions, as in other aspects of life, there was a lot of camaraderie. Rivals encouraged each other, and the winner received not so much a material prize as respect and recognition among his peers. These simple but sincere expressions of friendship and competition were an integral part of their lives. Although winter was a time of rest, work did not stop completely. Men repaired tools, wove baskets, and worked with leather. Women wove clothes, spun yarn, and did housework. The winter months were also used for planning the future. Farmers discussed what crops to plant in the spring and how to divide the work for the coming year. It was a time when they could focus on strategy and planning, which was just as important as physical labor. Winter in rural Rome was a period of relative calm, but that did not mean complete inactivity. Every day was filled with tasks that were not as visible as working in the fields, but no less important. Men whose hands were accustomed to the plow and sickle now engaged in more laborious work. They sharpened blades, repaired wooden parts of tools, crafted new handles, and mended woven baskets, which were necessary for harvesting. Some of them tanned animal skins, turning them into warm clothing or shoes. This work required patience and skill, and was often done in company around the hearth, which made it less tiring. Women were not idle either. Their days were filled with household chores. They spun wool and wove cloth for new clothes and bedding. It was monotonous but very important work. Under their hands, coarse wool was transformed into threads and then into warm tunics and cloaks. At such moments, when they worked together, their conversations flowed leisurely. They discussed family matters, shared news and gossip, and sometimes sang old songs that helped brighten the long winter evenings. Winter was also a time for passing on knowledge and experience. The elderly, who were no longer able to do heavy physical labor, shared their experience with the young. They taught them how to best care for the land, how to properly harvest seeds, and how to predict the weather. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries, was the most valuable treasure of a peasant family. Planning for the future was another important aspect of winter work. The whole family would gather to discuss what to plant the following year. They would analyze the previous year's harvest, the condition of the soil, and the weather conditions. These discussions were a kind of meeting where everyone had a say, and decisions were made that affected the survival of the entire family. It was a time when people could afford to think about the future rather than just surviving from day to day. During these months, when work was less intense, people found more time to socialize. Men working together often engaged in conversations on personal topics. Far from the strict social norms of the big city, they could afford to be more open. These close friendships, formed through working and socializing together, were an integral part of their lives. Sometimes these relationships were particularly deep, filled with tenderness and care. It was part of their world where survival depended on mutual help and trust. They not only shared their labor, but also shared their hearts. These relationships helped them survive hardships and find joy in simple things. Thus, winter work was not only a way to pass the time, but also a way to strengthen the community. People worked together, helped each other, and shared their thoughts and feelings. This solidarity was their main weapon against the cold, hunger, and loneliness. They understood that true wealth lies not in gold, but in the people around you. This realization helped them overcome any difficulties, making their lives, though difficult, meaningful. We immersed ourselves in a world where survival depended on simplicity and ingenuity. Roman peasants, lacking modern conveniences, used the wisdom of centuries to survive the harsh winters. They turned their clay houses into warm shelters, found salvation in hot food, and never forgot the power of human warmth. Their story is not only about survival, but also about strength of spirit, the ability to find joy in small things, and the fact that true warmth lies in the heart, not in technology. Now imagine a Roman peasant, accustomed to the mild winters of Italy, suddenly finding himself in snowy, freezing Siberia. Which of his survival methods would work and which would prove useless? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new historical journeys.